So you can always cite a particular skill that is important right now, and that may be true. But software changes, hardware changes, just businesses change. And 20 years from now, you need to have learned something else some other way. You need the ability to retrain yourself. But mostly you want to be on curves of learning where you get compound returns. Compound economic growth, compound learning, they have similar powerful properties.
Welcome to Future Skills, where we prepare you for a future of accelerating change. I'm Ludvig Sunstrom.
And I'm Mikael Syding.
If you have an interest in business, the economy, and a lot of other intellectual things, I'm pretty sure you'll like this episode, because today we talk to Tyler Cowen, who is a famous economist, public intellectual, author, blogger, podcaster, like a lot of things. He's really a master generalist. Tyler is the faculty director of George Mason's Mercatus Center, which is a university research center that focuses on market economy. He's also ranked amongst the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine. We talk mostly about the big picture stuff today. Tyler also has a bunch of practical tips to offer. For example, he says that you should reread the best books that you find, you should have hobbies that make you think more, not less, and that you should argue for what you think is correct, but still understand that you're likely to be wrong. And then we move on to the big picture perspective. For example, what is Tyler's view of economic growth and how does it happen? Have we seen the majority of economic growth from the internet, or is most of it yet to come? What are the two things that we as a society should prioritize above everything else? And also, when should we prioritize economic growth over the redistribution of wealth by government? What are the three things that are scarce in today's economy? How will future cities look in 20 to 30 years from now? And will the future economy reward generalists or specialists? These are some of the questions that we asked to Tyler. So let's jump into the conversation.
Let's kick off with something light. Often when I walk the sidewalk, I think about my strategy for meeting other people. And I'm quite a big guy, so I could walk in a straight line. But I don't, because that tends to lead me bumping into other people pretty hard. I was wondering, have you thought about the sidewalk problem and how do you do it?
The rational sidewalk strategy is to always veer to the right. What to me is a puzzle is how many people don't do that. So if you're in a country where people drive on the right, such as Sweden or the United States, you would think the convention on the sidewalk would be to go to the right, but it's not. But we should all do whatever small amount we can to encourage that convention for the future.
Yeah, so I usually try to veer a little bit to the right because I think that's the polite thing to do. But when people never veer at all, that kind of gets to me in the end. And sooner or later, I just try walking straight on instead.
You have to make eye contact. And in the meantime, don't look at your smartphone. Sidewalks would work much better if people would only look at their smartphones while they were stationary.
All right, great
I'm
answers.
guilty of that. By the way, you have an interest in food and cuisine, and you also have a website that's devoted to ethnic dining.
That's correct. It's called Tyler Cowen's Ethnic Dining Guide.
And I'm wondering, first, how long have you been into this? And what made you start it? And then also, do you believe that having some sort of long-term hobby or passion like this, that it's good for the brain, because then you can put your mind to ease and just relax?
To take those in reverse order, it's good to have hobbies and passions, but not so you relax, but so you end up thinking more. So hobbies are not really relaxing. You get intensely involved in them, and they force you to re-examine economic questions or professional questions from some other angle. In essence, they're there to stop you from relaxing. But I started my dining guide in the late 1980s when I lived in Orange County, California, which was quite suburban and boring, and the only thing to do was eat. So I collected a list of good places where I had eaten, and I mimeographed it and handed it out to my colleagues. And then later in the early 90s, I started putting this list up on the web, and I moved to Northern Virginia, and now it's become a full-scale blog, which I do all the time. I eat at a place, I review it.
Is food more than nutrition and taste to you?
Food is culture. Food is a form of economic exchange. Food reflects immigration. If you want to understand the trends in your country, tracking food is one very good way to do it. And in Sweden, this is obvious. obviously the case. How much of the good food, say, in Stockholm comes from people who are not necessarily born in Sweden? That was not the case 40 years ago.
When you say tracking food, what does that entail?
What are the new restaurants? Which ones are good? Why are they good? Food is also a wonderful way of studying management. Which ones are staying in business? Which ones are going bankrupt? What do you learn about real estate price trends in your city? Which cities are dynamic in your country? And on and on and on. Food is a mirror into all of these.
That's very cool.
Yeah, one interesting thing is about busy tourist streets where you always find restaurants offering 50 different dishes. And you know that all those 50 are pretty bad, but you still go there anyway. How come?
Well, I don't go there anyway. Maybe you do. But good places should be hard to find. And often they have a small number of dishes because they're staking their credibility on those dishes. And if they're not any good, they'll go out of business.
I listened to your interview with Michael Pollan. He has a slightly different view on food. He talks about mind-enhancing food, including psychedelics. You didn't seem that impressed by fungi.
I think psychedelics actually have a good track record in helping some people overcome depression. And I hope we can legalize or decriminalize them in a way so that this medical use can proceed. But if you're productive and happy, I think you're taking big chances by playing around with psychedelics. They change your personality, maybe in some ways you like, maybe in other ways you don't see. And there are so many other fun, productive things to do. I just don't quite see the point why one ought to do that.
If we put things on a spectrum, maybe we could have food and other hobbies at the one end and psychedelics on the other extreme. And in the middle, meditation. Do you do any meditation and what do you think about meditation?
I don't do meditation. I know people who do it and claim it's highly useful for them. I tried it. For me, it just seemed like a placebo. Now, placebos can have some amount of power. If you tell yourself you're doing something to make yourself better off, often you simply are better off. But maybe, we have other placebos that also work well. I would prefer to exercise, say, than to meditate. That also makes me better off.
Let's talk a little bit about economic progress and the economy. So, first of all, do you believe that we have rational grounds to keep believing in the idea of progress? Can we base it on things like GDP growth or scientific innovations and so forth?
The Western world has seen positive economic growth in most years outside of recessions. Scarcity is still a problem. There are things that people want that we don't always produce very well. There are institutional problems such as too much traffic congestion. There are mental health problems we could overcome if we had more wealth and more money to invest, say, in medical R&D. So I very much still believe in the ideas of progress and economic growth, and that the future can be a better place.
How do you see growth? Do you think of it as coming steadily, or do you see it in growth spurts, or how do you go about thinking about this?
I think it comes in bursts more than most economists do. Economists tend to see growth as fairly steady, and it is true that for a lot of American history, there's been a growth rate of a little more than 2%. But I think there are special periods of big breakthroughs, such as the Industrial Revolution or the era of introducing fossil fuels in the late 19th century. And right now, we're probably seeing one of those bursts with the internet. We haven't actually gotten a lot of the productive fruits from it yet, but it is changing our life in many, many ways. And I think in the future, we'll look back and see today's time as the beginning of another big growth spurt. But I don't think we're really yet seeing the growth.
Do we have to manage growth in any way? Do we need politicians to trigger growth and to actually make it happen, or are you more into Ray Kurzweil's view of it all?
Well, I think government and the private sector should be complements. I wouldn't quite say I believe in individual politicians managing growth, but you want an economy, say, to have automatic stabilizers. So if there's a recession, there are higher transfer payments to help maintain purchasing power. You want there to be some kind of prudential regulation of your banking system, but you want them to be as embedded as possible into the rule of law rather than just being a lot of political discretion.
If we go back to economic growth and we look at some nuances, it's going to be different in different countries, I suppose.
Sure. The United States is in a special position because we're the world's leading innovator for the most part.
How would you compare the US to, for example, India or China or some of these other countries that are growing fast, but they used to be third world countries?
Well, much of what China is doing is a kind of catch-up growth. They're They're copying technologies and institutions, and they were growing at 10%. Now they're growing maybe at 6%. And it's great that they can catch up so quickly. That was not possible in previous times because there wasn't enough information technology. But you shouldn't think of China as doing better on growth than the US. They're growing at 6 to 7% precisely because they're copying what Western nations have already done.
But relatively speaking, the growth is coming from different sectors, or rather applying different kinds of levers, right?
A lot of their growth has come from manufacturing. I feel the United States is neglecting manufacturing to its peril, but it's not easy to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And if you look at the European country that's maybe kept the most manufacturing, Germany, I think they're very vulnerable to Chinese competition. Both German law and culture, they're somewhat hostile toward tech. And as manufacturing becomes more tech-oriented, I think it will be hard for Germany to make that shift. Sweden actually is in a better position with regards to tech than Germany is.
Do you have any idea of why that is the case?
I think it has to do with Sweden being quite an open country and not viewing itself as a rival country to other leading powers. So Stockholm can take in talent and give it a kind of venue where many ideas flourish, and it doesn't feel it has to own anything as, oh, this is like all Swedish. And Swedes recognize that they're living in an open economy and a global setting where they have to adapt rather than getting things all their own way. That would be my guess.
In your book, The Great Stagnation, you talked about low-hanging fruit already having been plucked. But it almost sounds as if you are seeing new low-hanging fruits materializing.
It's materializing slowly, so I don't feel at all that growth is over. But there are periods where growth is quicker and slower. For the last 40 years in much of the West, growth has been slower. But I think with the internet, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles, we're seeing the glimmerings of this new era of future breakthroughs.
So would you classify these as general purpose technologies to come?
I think the computer is the general purpose technology. And we've had computers, of course, basically since World War II, but they were slow and they were large. And now we're finally in this setting where so many people can own computers, program them, do things with them, and we're figuring out how to build the rest of society around computers. But that takes many decades. It's not nearly as quick a process as you might think.
With more jobs being computer work, so to speak, do you think face-to-face interaction becomes more important as like a complement or premium?
Absolutely. So if you look, say, at online education, what's striking is how many people take online education at colleges near them. If you just look at rents, the crazy high rents in the Bay Area, in the US, in Manhattan, in Stockholm, those high rents are an indication that it's very valuable to be very close to other talented people. And that's a kind of proof that face-to-face is a complement with the internet, not a substitute.
Yeah, and as you say, knowledge is getting cheaper than ever, and you can access this from anywhere. And also, in your book, Average is Over, you talk about land as well as you just mentioned about the Bay Area. But in the future, and it's already happening with cheap knowledge and digital products, you don't really need either machinery or land. So, are you discounting digital products in any way? From my point of view, it almost seems as if we're already producing all the physical goods that we need.
Well, we know that rents are crazy high in major cities, right? So one of the useful things about the internet is it helps you meet exactly the people you should be meeting. But if you're just completely isolated and you have the internet and you email these people and you never meet them, that's not that valuable. It turns out the internet is the way you get to meet the people who will become your peers. You will work with them or for them. And that again brings us back to face-to-face. So I don't think we can ever get rid of face-to-face. I don't think we've produced all of the material things we need. People want additional, clothing or cars or better food or more nutrition or better healthcare. There's always something more that they want. It may just be a service. It's not always physical. Someone taking care of them when they're old. And I think we're very far from having abolished scarcity.
Do you have an idea of a specific place where people could do this face-to-face now rather than in the Bay Area? Is there a specifically good country or city right now?
Oh, well, Tokyo, London, Stockholm, Manhattan, Washington, D.C., Berlin to some extent. So there are definitely places where things are happening. And again, you see that reflected in rents. And it's pretty obvious where they are. And young people know to go there. And those places are becoming more crowded. They're becoming more interesting. But it's also problematic in terms of handling the flow with respect to infrastructure and, again, just basic affordability.
What about less obvious obvious places like, I don't know, Lagos, African cities?
I went to Lagos last year for 7 days, and overall I was impressed. And they have a strong tech community and a lot of talent. One of their biggest problems is simply traffic. So face-to-face in Lagos is very hard because you can just be going halfway across town and be hit by a 2.5-hour traffic jam. So I'm bullish on Lagos, but it needs to solve some very basic internal problems before it's really a place where face-to-face is going to work very well.
I think you could draw parallel to Bangkok sometimes. It's also a big...
Absolutely.
Yeah. Speaking of the economy, and in terms of the economic thinking, for those who are not familiar with your previous books, how would you contrast some of your ideas against famous thinkers like Hayek, John Maynard Keynes, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Frederick Bastiat, and so forth?
To start with Adam Smith, he was one of the first economists I read. I read Wealth of Nations. I think I was 14 years old. It had a big influence on me. It gave me the sense of economics as an overarching science that could try to explain, parts of history and parts of politics. And I agree with Smith's general approach that usually markets work well, but also you do need governments to supply public goods. Hayek was another big influence on me. The idea that markets mobilize decentralized information in an effective way using the price system. It's still one of the most important insights of economics. John Maynard Keynes, he's the person I think who stated most effectively the notion that negative shocks to aggregate demand will cause a lot of unemployment, and he was basically correct about that. Bastiat was a brilliant 19th century economist who made the case for free trade very eloquently and explained opportunity cost very clearly, that as an economist you need to think about not only what is seen, but also what is unseen, what you're foregoing. And that's a basic insight. Often voters, politicians still don't get it. Were those all the names?
Also John Stuart Mill.
Oh, John Stuart Mill. He's one of the most eclectic economists. He was highly philosophical. He thought very deeply. He understood the humanities and economics as being very closely tied together. He also had a career, in the real world. He served in Parliament. He was a major advocate for women's rights, anti-slavery. I consider him a very great figure that economists should admire and in some ways try to copy.
Can you explain how you can review these names so brilliantly just off the cuff? I hardly could do that with my friends.
Well, I've read them all and I work with these ideas, basically every day. And actually, I've reread them all. So someone like Keynes or Adam Smith, I would guess I've read those books 4 or 5 times. Hayek, maybe more than that. A lot of Mill, I've read maybe 3 times. The autobiography is one of my favorite books. So look, this is my job, my hobby, right? I should be able to do it.
Would you say Keynes is a Keynesian in the modern term?
No, Keynes is quite different from modern Keynesians. So if you're thinking about practical remedies, Keynes's idea was that investment is inherently unstable and governments should nationalize investment. I think A, that's mostly wrong, and B, it's not what most Keynesians today believe. A lot of Keynesians today have concluded that monetary policy can be a pretty effective way of maintaining aggregate demand. Actually, the Swedish central bank, going back as far as the 30s, was in a way the main alternative to Keynes. You had Swedish economists like Myrdal and Lindahl and Ohlin coming out of the work of Excel, basically suggesting that monetary and exchange rate policies could get you a lot of good Keynesian results, but without requiring as much intervention as a lot of the Bloomsbury crowd favored. And this is one of the great contributions of Swedish economics. And I think that perspective on Keynes has basically won out and convinced most people today. So I can talk about the Swedes too, if we're going to play this game.
I can tell. So what do you think about the current stimulus environment with a lot of monetary stimulus and quite a lot of fiscal stimulus on top of that? Is it working? Should we keep doing this after 10 years?
Well, if you're talking about the United States, Donald Trump did a lot of new fiscal stimulus. That was probably a mistake. It has boosted the growth rate in the short term, but we'll have to pay that money back. And it seems quite imprudent to me. Monetary stimulus right now, I don't think it's very strong. The monetary aggregates are high, but we're paying interest on reserves. And that's in essence lowering the velocity of money. And if you look at price inflation rates in the United States, they're rising somewhat, but they've basically been slightly below 2% for many years. Probably they were too low. And we still don't have a problem with excess inflation. Most of the Western world, Japan, could say the same.
You have called yourself a small L libertarian. Could you explain what that means?
Well, I think I'm broadly libertarian in the sense that I believe in rule of law and the powers pillars of capitalism and a market economy, the importance of innovation and how innovation often comes through decentralized sources. And I very much believe in democracy and what you might call classical Western institutions. But when I look at a lot of other people who call themselves libertarian, they seem to assume a priori governments cannot do any good. And that to me seems quite wrong. And we need to be empiricists and understand the virtues of markets. But when either markets fail or governments succeed, absolutely admit and even emphasize that's the case. So to me, that puts me like in the small L libertarian camp.
If you were the head of the Federal Reserve, would you? What would you do the coming year, you think?
I think Jay Powell is a brilliant head of the Federal Reserve. I cannot imagine we could have picked a better person. He is a wonderful listener. He asks amazing questions, and he understands the political economy of Washington, and he understands what kind of help he can or cannot receive from Donald Trump, and the need to build up a power base in Congress. And I feel very happy and comfortable with him at the helm there. I wouldn't make any changes, is another way of putting it.
All right. When you wrote the book, Average is Over, well, to begin with, what did that term mean to you?
In the future, I think we will see more and more careers where people either do really very well or they don't do so well at all. And the key question will be, are computers and the internet augmenting your productivity, or are you competing against computers? And if you're competing against the computer, I would say sooner or later the computer will win.
Right.
So if I look at income statistics from, say, the United States, there's like a top 10 or 15% doing really very well. And for a lot of other categories, wages have been pretty sluggish.
I think this book is extremely good. I read it a couple of years ago. I read it again.
Thank you.
Most of the things that you wrote in it have come true, or are coming true, I think.
Yes.
It's really, really accurate. So I recommend everyone who's listening to really read that book. And one thing you say in that book is that there are 3 things that are scarce in today's economy: land, natural resources, intellectual property, and unique skills.
That's correct. And by land, I really mean quality land. So there's plenty of empty land, say in the American West, but no one wants to go there. But urban land where productive labor is clustered just keeps on going up in value. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Would you add something else to that list today?
No, intellectual property. You look at a tech company, some of the value of the tech company is patents. Other parts are intangibles, such as brand name or processes or reputation for recruiting talent. But you can think of those as intellectual property in the broad sense. And that's so much more important than physical assets or we own this factory. It's striking how much intangible capital has become important.
Regarding the polarization in Average is Over between the well-off and the not so well-off, do you mean that as from an absolute point of view, in real wages, real?
Correct.
Yeah. So I'm having quite a hard time to see how we would not repeat the development from, let's say, the Stone Ages till now, where the least well-off are much better off today than actually the best off were a couple of thousand years ago.
I do think that will happen, but I think it will happen in a strange way. The least well-off will get many free things. I'm not sure their wages will go up, say, at 3% a year, the way they did in the post-war era. I think there's too much competition from countries such as China, other low-wage countries, and competition from automation. So the way those people will be better off is getting a kind of bounty raining upon them from new technologies rather than just getting pay hikes.
So it's kind of bread and circuses, but just way better.
Exactly.
I think this is true objectively, but human beings are not very objective people.
Yes, it's a political problem, and both of our countries are seeing this.
Yeah, exactly. And when people get stuff for free, or if it happens in a gradual manner that's below our perception, then we don't notice it and we don't appreciate it. So you really need to study the texts and contextualize the growth to appreciate it, I think.
That's exactly right. And it feels to people like their jobs are not always better in quality, that companies are maybe not always investing so much in them anymore. They're competing against outsourced labor. There's an inner core of high quality workers treated very well. And then other workers are a bit, fending for themselves. It's not entirely untrue, that caricatured picture.
Yeah, and then it's very easy to become envious in today's society with social media and the internet, always seeing someone who's better off.
The interesting thing, I think, is people grow the most envious of those who are close to them, not the very wealthy. So if someone makes 10% more than you do, you're more likely to envy them, say, than Bill Gates.
Yeah, and also in the same age cohort, rather than, for example, comparing yourself to people in the same, a better classification. So if I'm 27 and I can't really define what I do for a living, but I do a lot of things. But if I compare myself to other people the same age, some of them are doing really well, others are not doing well. But there are very few people are doing what I'm doing. So it's a definition problem.
And I think Facebook and social media make this harder because you see how well other people are doing that you know. And maybe that's an exaggerated portrait, but that makes it all the worse. Like, oh my goodness, what a wonderful vacation she had. You know, these lovely photos. And they're staged, but still the vacation happened. And you envy that.
Yeah.
Do you think there is any level of absolute wealth where everybody will be happy, or will there always be a revolution around the corner?
I wouldn't quite say a violent revolution, but people are discontent by human nature. And Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French theologian, said, like, the basic problem of humanity is that people cannot sit still in a room. But that's also what impels us to create. So I think this mix of dissatisfaction and having a lot of malcontents, that will be with us forever.
Yeah, we spoke to the neuroscientist L. Goldberg, and he said that Magellan would not have gone and explored if he was on Prozac.
Exactly.
Is that one of the stubborn attachments that we are discontent?
Well, Stubborn Attachments is the title of my new book, which came out 2 weeks ago. And that's a book about economic growth and human rights. And I argue the stubborn attachments we should have are to those two notions, economic growth and human rights. And we should pursue other values less and those values much more.
When you talk about growth, you say that people have kind of lost focus on how important growth is. Could you make your case for why growth is so important and what kind of growth?
Economic growth compounds over time. So if your economy grows, say, 7% a year, you double in per capita wealth every 10 years. That's amazing. If your economy grows at, say, 1% a year, you double in wealth basically every 70 years. That's a very slow process. If you play out higher rates of growth over decades and centuries, you end up with much, much wealthier societies that are clearly just better to live in and freer and have more opportunity and more creativity. In any given year, whether the growth rate is 1, 2, 3%, it doesn't look that important, and we're myopic, and that's why we underestimate the importance of economic growth. But I would just say I adjust economic growth for quality of the environment and certain unpriced intangibles. So I don't think you can look only at GDP, but GDP is a pretty good starting point.
Are today's wealth, is it unequivocally better than, let's say, 50 years ago or 5,000 years ago?
Certainly for the Western world it is. 5,000 years ago, there's not really a comparison. Probably life expectancy then was, 30 at most. But 50 years ago, cars were much more dangerous. People died at much younger ages. Issues such as women's rights or the ability to, freely, openly be gay were far less advanced than they are today. The ability to stay in touch with family and friends was much, much weaker. And the Western world was a much worse place.
At what price should we focus on growth? I listened to, I can't recall who you were talking to, but about the ethics of infinity or something like that. Like how important is it for us to focus solely on growth in order to create a better future for our descendants that we don't even know whether they will be born or not?
Growth and human rights are the two things I think we should focus on. And I really do mean at the macro level, focusing only on those. So if your choice is to grow or redistribute, you're better off growing. We should still redistribute some wealth, but we should do it in growth-enhancing manners. And the idea that this becomes an obsessive focus of our societies, that's the main argument of my book.
All right, but individuals should still be free to focus on maximizing their own lifetime happiness or enjoyment.
I argue in the book that individuals should follow what is sometimes called common sense morality, which is not exactly maximizing your own happiness, but it's what, say, wise grandparents might tell you. Be loyal to your friends, get a good job, work hard, save money, marry, take care of your family. Basic tenets of morality that are close to universal across many cultures. They're actually part of the underlying recipe for maximizing economic growth.
Yeah, you talked about that in the Reason podcast.
That's right.
Are you getting any pushbacks on common morality, or what do you call it?
No, I think the world is looking for common sense morality to be stronger again, especially in the United States, as we have a leader who so often violates it. There's this great nostalgia for common sense morality. I think the biggest pushback I'm getting on the book, probably it's from Western Europeans, actually, which is a part of the world that doesn't believe that strongly in economic growth anymore. They're not doing it very well. They're trying to tell themselves it's not important. There's a big wave of problems coming going their way that they're largely in denial about. And rather than growing at, say, 1.5% a year, Western Europe needs to be growing at 2.2% a year. Over time, it's going to make a huge difference.
When you say there are some problems that we Europeans are closing our eyes to, could you give a couple of examples?
Paying for pensions would be a huge problem. Taking care of your working classes better, having a positive agenda so that social democrats become more than 18% of the electorate in a lot of your countries. And that requires having money to spend, which is in turn based on economic growth. Taking care of the current and forthcoming wave of immigrants and refugees from sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa, even parts of Europe itself. Making budgets work, just being more innovative. All that requires resources. And Western Europe, it will do okay, but it could be a much, much better place than it is right now. And I worry that the EU is in some ways dissolving, not on paper, but, in practice. It's not handling Brexit very well. It didn't handle the allocation of the Syrian refugees very well. The Italian fiscal constitutional crisis, again, another problem that needs more money. It's not handling very well. There's not like a banking union or a fiscal union that's really working. So over time, those problems will chip away at the cooperative structure that's in place. And I'm a big fan of the EU, but it does need more money in some way.
Do you have any practical thoughts on how to resolve arguments? I think you talk about this in the book.
Well, I think most of us should be more epistemically modest. That is, realize, we should argue for what we think is correct, but there's a pretty high chance we're likely to be wrong. And that will help limit polarization. It may help people agree if they come to the dialogue, each realizing, well, there's some chance I'm wrong here. Doesn't mean they should stop arguing for what they think is true, but it's an attitude that should be more common in what is now a fairly polarized political setting.
Yeah, it's too easy to just get angry and fire off some stupid thing on Twitter or whatever.
So that might work for individuals, but politicians have they have a stake. They have a reason to show themselves with resolve and portraying themselves as knowing everything. So how could we remedy that situation that politicians can't really afford to say, I don't know?
I don't know how we get back to the earlier world. So in a lot of the post-war era, there was more governance by consensus. The tone of debate was more reasonable. I know a lot of people blame social media. I think that's possibly the case. But the data also show politics has become most polarized amongst the elderly, and they use social media the least. And in the US, at least, cable television seems at least as guilty. Most people are not on Twitter, in fact, and they're still polarized. So I don't think we understand it very well. But there has been some shift. The good news is there are long periods of time when we were more reasonable, and it doesn't seem to me impossible that it could someday be that way again. But I don't know how to get there.
Yeah, I think a lot of this has to do with, the common word is identity politics, but what's really underlying that, I think, is coalition groups. Have you thought about this?
Yes. And, maybe globalization went faster than we can digest. And then you have this weakening of parties, both in Europe and in the United States. And say in Germany, like the center thinning out and people moving to the fringes, the Greens replacing SPD, AfD taking over some vote share that used to go to, CSU or CDU. And in the United States, like the loyalty is to Trump more than to the Republican Party from his supporters. So there's a personalization going on that I find mostly negative, and loss of faith in the center. Maybe the internet lets people see too easily how feckless some of their elites are. Again, I think we don't understand it yet.
Are you familiar with director's law? The middle classes will extort the upper classes and the lower classes for their own benefit in terms of taxpayer money and how the government should redistribute wealth.
I think that was true when Aaron Director said it. I don't think it's true now. You see in a lot of our countries, I don't know the Swedish data, but in the US, the middle class has actually been the big loser. Right now, it seems to me the elderly are doing the extorting from the young rather than the middle class.
How does that work in terms of politics? What kind of implications does it have?
Well, we're aging, all of our societies, and the elderly tend to vote at higher rates. And I think they're more cynical voters in a way, less idealistic. So they vote for who will give them benefits, pensions, Social Security, Medicare. And those are important programs, but there do need to be checks on them. And in the United States, we're spending past the point of the checks and balances, that people are taking much more out than they're putting in, and we're just postponing the day of reckoning. And I do blame elderly voters for quite a bit of that, and politicians who cater to them.
Based on the work of, I think, foremost Richard Thaler, but also Barry Schwartz, I think governments are becoming less and less neutral and more into actively nudging people into making decisions. Do you do you agree? And do you think that's a good or a bad development?
I see more small-scale nudges, and many of those are working fine. I'm not anti-nudge, but I also see countries like China that are nudging people using extensive surveillance and facial surveillance in ways that are rather quickly becoming quite oppressive. And I think we need to decide where to draw the line on this. But I see at the same time governments also just becoming less powerful, less trusted, and less able to steer people. So we're somehow getting both trends at once, and we want to get the best of each side of that rather than the worst. I fear we may get the worst.
Do you have a direct experience of China's social credit score?
Well, there are intersections in China. If you jaywalk across the intersection, they take a photo of you and they simply dock your bank account, and people have stopped jaywalking. Now, I get that that's useful, but I don't actually favor doing things that way. I was on a flight in China recently, and when the flight landed, the police came and they had a picture of a man taken from facial surveillance, and they checked all the passengers on the flight, matched the picture which had been printed out to the man, and just took him away and arrested him, and he'll probably never be seen again. He might be guilty, but I don't think he's going to get a fair trial. So I think these trends are also very dangerous.
Right. That, like you're saying, that works operationally, but there's also an opportunity cost, going back to what you said before. And it's difficult to contextualize or get a good sense how big that opportunity cost is in terms of maybe the population feeling watched and that occupying their thinking so they can't be creative, for example.
That's right. I'm a big opponent of facial surveillance. I think nudges without surveillance are not so oppressive, but nudges with surveillance are very dangerous.
In your new book, Stubborn Attachment, one important point that you make is that we should be more concerned about the fragility of our civilization. Could you explain this a bit more?
Civilizations have ended in previous historical eras, either due to war or conquest or environmental problems, and we simply take for granted we're on a sustainable path. But as you know, many nations on this planet have nuclear weapons. There are other weapons of mass destruction. We've gotten to the point, it's so long since they've been used, we assume it won't happen, and that's a big mistake. I would invest a lot more resources into making nuclear systems safe and having hotlines and having established protocols across countries so there's not a nuclear war, say, by mistake. That would be one example of how we could make our civilizations more sustainable.
Let's say you put, I don't know how much money is required, but let's just say like $40 billion. How should that money be spent to prevent the nuclear war?
On some of these issues, we are starting already. So, for instance, better contact with the North Koreans. We don't know how good their technologies are. We don't want them to read by mistake that there's an incoming flight of missiles and then they would retaliate. And in fact, it was maybe a flock of geese. So actually helping them in some ways build up their capabilities and having better communications. I'm very worried about hypersonic weapons, nuclear weapons that travel so quickly. They really cut down the amount of time a leader has as to whether or not he or she should retaliate. So I would like to ban hypersonic weapons if we can and help the nuclear powers, Pakistan, North Korea, that are less technologically advanced, have better backup warning surveillance systems for what's happening to them.
Do you have a short list of things like nuclear weapons that contribute to the fragility of our civilizations and that we actually could do something about with the government money? I'm thinking of things like AI and the environment, maybe.
Biological weapons are a great danger. We could have more research and development on cures or just better local healthcare infrastructure. So if a pandemic were to start, we would know more quickly and react better. I don't worry much about artificial intelligence ending the world. It's human intelligence I worry about, or human non-intelligence. There's a risk of an asteroid strike. It's happened earlier in world history. So we should invest more in building up ultimate capabilities to knock out an asteroid that would be headed our way. Super volcanoes are another risk. I'm not sure there's anything we can do about those, but I do worry about them. Those to me are some of the major risks right now.
Do you have this would be interesting. Do you have a figure in mind in how much we maybe reasonably could spend on looking for asteroids? I mean, AI could be a good way of looking for them.
I think we're pretty good at looking for them, but knocking them out. If a big asteroid were headed our way, how well we could respond is, to say the least, an open question. And to be in a place where 30, 50 years from now, we could destroy or steer away the asteroid without creating a lot more mini asteroids, that does seem to me a solvable problem, even if we can't solve it right now. So I would take current budgets in these areas and, multiply them by 5 or 10, in fact, because right now we're not doing that much.
Apart from all these physical dangers, do you see a societal reason to that makes us fragile?
There's a certain amount of moral decay. There are problems with addictive substances, environmental problems. Those are all very important. We should address them. But I don't see them ending life on Earth. They're just like very bad problems that we could improve. So existential risk that would really end civilization, I think that's a relatively small number of factors.
Is there any particular drug that you think have become like the worst or disproportionately worse than the other drugs?
Well, it's clearly alcohol, which somehow has ended up as socially acceptable, right? But it kills more people than opioids. I've been an advocate of people voluntarily just not drinking alcohol and shunning it socially, treating it as something quite unpleasant, as if someone were to carry a submachine gun into a departmental meeting. And I think we should encourage, people to stop drinking, period.
How should we do that?
Few people agree with me by setting an example. So I think in the U.S. last year, it's estimated 90,000 people died for alcohol-related reasons. That's an astonishing number.
And apart from the deaths, just think about how many hours are killed by alcohol, both consuming it and then, getting back afterwards.
Or lives ruined. Now, the thing is, as you know, most people drink responsibly, just like most people use guns responsibly. But maybe the way to solve the problem is for drinking to become more like smoking, where it's just not really quite acceptable to be in it like a meeting and you just light up a cigarette or cigar. I would like to see drinking be treated the same way.
I have a few questions regarding institutions and growth. So to start with, do you like the US Constitution? And I'm thinking about it as it was written from the beginning.
Well, as it was written, it was quite a disaster because it allowed for slavery. So I can't say I like that at all. But the way it has evolved since the Civil War, I think it's quite an effective document and it works pretty well.
Is there anything in particular that you don't like about the Constitution as it is now? Any of the amendments?
I'm pretty happy with it. With the Trump presidency, we've had to re-examine the Constitution. And I think the key weaknesses in it are simply like how well can you count on Congress or the courts to enforce different parts of it? And so far, actually, I think it's still working. But the real problems in the document are not in the writing, but whether people still believe in it and will incur political risk to enforce it.
Okay, great. What do you think about the FDA? Do you think growth and prosperity could be better if the FDA was relaxed or even abolished? Or would the cost be too high?
One of the best things the Trump administration has done is to speed up the approval process for new drugs. So normally it can take like $1 billion in 10 years, and that discourages innovation. It seems to cost more lives than it has saved. And this is one area where we're making big improvements. I don't think you can abolish the FDA. You would end up with just a blizzard of lawsuits that would cost drug companies and innovators more than the current procedures. But to really have a lot of accelerated tracks, we did this with drugs that targeted HIV, and that worked. We got those drugs a lot quicker. It saved hundreds of thousands of lives, maybe more. So this can be done. We can have a major positive impact, and I'm pleased to see that it's happening.
Yeah, and in extremely pressing cases, it should be possible for the end clients to volunteer for trials.
Absolutely. So if you're dying and there's a drug that's not available to you, I think you have a kind of medical right to self-defense. You should be able to take a chance. I also think the United States should automatically approve any drug the European Union approves. You have good enough regulators. That should be good enough for us. There are drugs you can get in Europe and not in the US. That we could change overnight.
Are those thoughts controversial?
When you tell people, a lot of people agree. They're controversial in the sense that they don't gain political traction. They're not people's priority. We're arguing about a lot of issues such as immigration or polarization or political correctness that consume our emotional energy and distract from a lot of very important questions of science.
And my final question on institutions, what do you think about the competition authorities? Maybe you could talk about them in the same way as the FDA.
American antitrust, I think, mostly has done a good job. The real job of antitrust is just to discourage collusion. I think you have to realize when a lawsuit finally is brought, often the suit is a bad one. The suits against Microsoft, IBM, probably those were mistakes. but having a competition authority there, it just limits excess mergers and collusion. But it's always a delicate balance, because when you ask those authorities to do too much, they're probably not going to do a good job. Right now, I do not view the major tech companies as such a huge problem. I would say that's a controversial attitude. I think they give consumers wonderful things for free. There are some problematic sides of that, but for the most part, people are very happy with that bargain.
Going back to what you said about as a solution to the FDA and medical companies in the US adopting the same things as in the EU, is the reason that you say that? Is it as a way to bypass lobbying, for example?
Absolutely. And this way, you don't have to duplicate all the effort. And again, European regulators are, quite reliable. And there are, for instance, hypertension drugs you can get in Europe and not in the US. And I think it's just inertia that we don't allow that to happen. Ideally, there should be an EU-US free trade agreement that would regularize all those procedures, and that you would in turn approve all drugs that went through our processes automatically.
That's a great suggestion, I think.
My colleague Alex Tabarrok has argued for this at length, and it would save money also. So it doesn't cost anything. You don't have to spend on a new program. You could spend less and get more and better drugs and lower the costs for your innovators. Maybe over time, you could extend this, say, to Japan and some other nations. I don't think you can extend it everywhere, but there are other reliable regulators other than just EU and US.
Since you mentioned him, I think this is a good place to just mention your blog, Marginal Revolution. There are a couple of hilarious videos there as well. Yesterday, I watched Who Wants to Be a Trillionaire? And I actually laughed out loud when I watched your animations of Mugabe.
Oh, good. Thank you. We create these online videos for economic education. It's called Marginal Revolution University, and they're free and open to the whole world. So I would encourage people to check them out.
Let's shift the conversation towards the future and future skills. And what do you think future cities could look like?
It's interesting. If you go back even to the 1980s, which was not that long ago, and you look at sketches, how people thought like cities would look in 2015, they have these wild, radical, futuristic visions, with flying cars and gleaming skyscrapers and basically a bunch of things that never happened. So my best forecast is cities won't look that different 30, 40 years from now. They'll be nicer. They'll have better education systems. They'll be more gentrified, maybe more walkable, better transit. But I don't think we're going to revolutionize how they look or how they work. I think we're settled into certain urban modes that right now are quite hard to change.
I think that's good news for real estate developers, because if you built a skyscraper today, you wouldn't want the city to look completely different just 30 years from now.
That's right. And I think also if you ask, what are people actually unhappy about in cities? Now, Sweden is quite different here, but in the United States, what they're actually unhappy about are the public school systems. And I think we'll fix a lot of those. That's like the frontier where we should be investing, not somehow making it look like a science fiction novel.
How should we invest in that? Or rather, how should you in the United States invest in it?
We should take greater care to fire bad teachers, and we do know who they are. We should pay the good teachers much more. We should raise the status of teaching as a profession. We should experiment more with charter schools. Those are some things I would start with. We should make homeschooling much easier and more acceptable and treat it better at the level of college admissions.
Those are great suggestions. I like them and I agree with them.
And what could the real stakeholders do? And I'm talking about the young people. What could they do to add pressure for this change? Maybe get their own education outside the system, or do you have any ideas?
Well, people do this already with the internet, and young people do it on their own, and that's great. It's a wonderful complement to public education, but you also need to know how to use the internet, and public education and the internet should supplement each other. You need both to work well. In Sweden, as you know, you've had a lot of problems with declining test scores in relative terms. In the PISA rankings, Sweden has really fallen, and I'm not sure why this is the case, but you too have a big problem with education. I think it's not like centered in your cities necessarily, but it's a crisis.
Yeah, it is. We actually talked about this in our Swedish podcast recently with an educator and memory master.
What's the main reason why? Is it immigration or something else?
Immigration is definitely part of it, but I don't know how to give the proper amount of weight to each factor. But I think it's kind of like you were talking about in the Complacent Class. It's that kind of phenomenon where it's a gradual change in psychological attitude where people are just despondent.
I also think it's like when only third world countries or poor countries become good at soccer. We have had it too good, so we're becoming complacent and hubristic. So I think young people think that they don't really need to try that hard.
Yeah, I see some of that in America too. So often it's immigrants or Asian American immigrants who are at the top of their classes. Good for them. But the rest of us need to get our act together.
Yeah, many of Sweden's best startups, the ones that actually go global, they have immigrants at the helm. So I think it has a lot to do with ambition.
Speaking of education and raising the status of teachers, have you seen Bill Gates' program for this?
Yes, the Gates Foundation has done a lot in education, but I think they've had a hard time making progress. Those are bureaucratic systems. The people who actually have a voice are parents rather than outside foundations. So I'm not sure they've been effective.
How would you describe the US middle class of today compared to the one 50 years ago?
Well, it's ailing. I mean, in absolute terms, it's better off than it was 50 years ago, but manufacturing jobs are becoming more scarce. People in the middle often are not skilled enough to work with technology effectively. They face more competition. And I think in relative terms, the US middle class has been hurting now for at least 15 years.
What kind of skills and know-how do you think will become more useful and valuable as expertises in the future?
It's something quite general, and that's the ability to retrain yourself. So you can always cite a particular skill that is important right now, and that may be true, but software changes, hardware changes, just businesses change. And 20 years from now, you need to have learned something else some other way. So retraining yourself is not actually very easy. Most people can't do it. They don't even do well being trained in college. Most people don't even go to college or finish college. So I think that's the tough problem.
So are you thinking about retraining yourself for a second career, or are you immune?
I retrain myself all the time. So those online economics videos that we talked about a few minutes ago, I had to train myself how to make videos, for instance. I also had to train myself how to raise the money to get those videos funded, since we don't charge people or have advertisements. So I try to always be retraining myself, but it's very hard and it's strenuous.
Yeah. Going back to what you said earlier about there possibly being an increasing demand for common sense morality, at the root of that is a sort of talent for generalism or being able to piece together eclectic knowledge. So if you look at the trend of specialization versus generalization, where do you see that going in the future for different kinds of professions?
I don't know that specialization and generalization are opposites. What I see is most people become more specialized, but that opens up room for generalists at the same time. So CEOs are typically generalists, and more CEOs are being hired outside of their original sector of expertise. And CEO pay has been rising. So that to me suggests, well, not everyone can be a generalist, but if you're good at it, it's really a very promising future.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the way that I think about generalism and generalist knowledge is like packaging. It's like you have to know which kind of different expertises you want to have, and then you want to get them strategically over time and know how they work together. I can't explain how, but it makes sense in my head.
And I think smaller countries, the returns to being a generalist are higher. I used to live in New Zealand, and it was amazing different things I would be asked to do. And I'd say, oh, that's not my area. And they'd be like, hey, there's 4 million people here. Please do it.
Have you seen A Clockwork Orange?
Yes, I have, but not recently.
In it, they have a quite interesting ethical dilemma. Well, they don't treat it as a dilemma. They just simply reprogram the main character from a free but evil individual to like a mechanical orange just doing whatever they say and tell him to do, but he's not really alive. You call yourself a consequentialist. That is something, well, you can explain it better than I can. So how do you see your consequentialist ideas in contrast to A Clockwork Orange?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence from penal systems that the people we manage to rehabilitate are those who take responsibility for their own lives. Sometimes this is done through religion. Other times it's simply done through better opportunity. So they become more autonomous, more in control of themselves. So people who are sincere consequentialists, I don't think they have to face some repugnant conclusion of wanting to control or manipulate all of the bad people. They should look for ways to give them greater agency and responsibility.
Do you think that, as a follow-up, that evil, hyper-violent character in A Clockwork Orange, is that a more real and thus better person than he is in the end when he's programmed to be good?
I do think he's become a better person in a superficial way. Again, sort of looking at the data, what do I see in the world today? Rather than forcing people's eyes open and making them watch movies to control them, the way they're being controlled is with a mix of marijuana and pornography. So those are things they're choosing to do that are quite passive, and they're entirely voluntary. And I don't think that's a wonderful outcome either, to go from being a troublemaker into marijuana and pornography. But again, if you're looking at actual social control, that's another way that it's happening. And coercive control, it tends to backfire, is what we're learning more and more. more. And like internet pornography and marijuana seems to work. I don't find that entirely reassuring.
No, it kind of ties into your ideas about sustainable growth and sustainable development.
And complacency. We have these new technologies. They're making some people way too complacent.
Yeah, too easy to use and too strong stimulus.
And we're not going to ban them. I mean, marijuana has been illegal in most places, but people still get it. It's not really feasible to ban pornography. So, I mean, we're just going to have to live with it.
Yeah, I think it's going to kill a lot of people's ambition because it's just so much easier to sit back and smoke weed rather than take a stand or develop your skills and try to believe in yourself. And, it takes energy and it takes hard work. It's easier to just get a fast reward.
Yeah, people claim weed is getting better. I wouldn't know. I've never ever tried it. I can believe it's getting better. Most goods and services are getting better.
Yeah. You are doing tremendous work in getting people to think about reality and take responsibility for long-term development. Another channel that has the same idea is TED Talks. What do you think about TED Talks? Are they too superficial or are they doing good work?
They're a huge social benefit. Most of them I haven't seen, of course. Even if they're superficial, you need to communicate to superficial people, right? So that's great if some of them are superficial. And then people become much less superficial once they're interested. So I don't worry if they're not all, detailed and brilliant. I don't watch them much myself. Maybe if I'm going to meet someone as a kind of preparation, I might watch, but I don't just watch for fun. They're too slow and I prefer to read.
Yeah, I myself, I subscribe to TED Talks, but audio, and I listen to them in higher than normal speed. And I always listen when I'm out walking my dog, so I kind of get them for free and in huge volume.
If I'm going to interview someone, I'll listen to their TED Talk, basically.
Speaking of that, you did make a TED Talk, right?
That's correct.
Could you tell us a bit about it?
It was first a TEDx talk, which is a different system, even though it has a similar name. But the TED people liked it so much, they elevated it into a TED Talk. And it was about the dangers of simple stories and how we rely too much on narrative and that reality is messy and we should resist the temptation to turn everything into a story.
That's quite interesting and meta, considering the discussion we just had about TED Talks being superficial.
It was like a critique of other TED Talks. So they invited me to this event. I think it was like at the last minute, or I didn't have time to prepare. And I looked at like a TED Talk or two, and I even got like a little irritated. I guess I shouldn't have, but I thought, well, I'm going to like give a talk against TED Talks. And then this talk came out with very, very little preparation, and it ended up becoming a TED Talk. That's the funny thing.
I watched it. It's good.
I want to follow up on being a generalist, because you are very well read and knowledgeable, but you've also been learning over a very long period of time. So I'm wondering, how would someone who is maybe 20, 25 years old go about really becoming a master generalist over time?
I started like at age 13, 14. So I think if you're 25, I don't want to quite announce to you that it's too late, but you're at a big disadvantage. 20, probably it's still possible. So, buy a time machine, go back in time and start as early as you can would be big advice I would give to anyone.
Or focus on technology and invent a time machine.
Yes, that would do it. But mostly you want to be on curves of learning where you get compound returns. And it's related to the ideas in stubborn attachments. Compound economic growth, compound learning, they have similar powerful properties.
All right. Final question. Where can people reach you and find your new book?
Well, if they just Google my name, Tyler Cowen, Cowen, Google brings you to a lot of what I do. My new book called Stubborn Attachments, it's available on Amazon, maybe not in every country just yet, but it will be. Or you can order it from the United States, or if you have trouble finding it, just write me. On Twitter, I'm at Tyler Cowen. My blog is Marginal Revolution. My podcast series is called Conversations with Tyler, and there's more of me. You can get to it using Google.
Yeah, I've listened to quite a few of your episodes on Conversations with Tyler. I think it's really good. And but I wanted to ask you about the level of your most recent book. Who is it written for? Could just anybody read it, or do you need some background knowledge in economics, for example?
Well, it's written for me. Like a lot of my books, I don't think quite anyone can read it, but I think most educated readers can. There are some parts of the argument where I just like argue flat out philosophy or economics, and I don't walk the reader through all of the terms, but I think most people can understand it, or certainly almost all of the argument. So it's a very short book. It's intended to be readable, but I just like sat down and said what I thought and threw it at people. There's no calculated attempt to like open every chapter with an anecdote or make it sound like most commercial books sound. It's a very idiosyncratic text.
Did you think it up fast, or is it questions that you've been pondering a long time?
It's my slowest book. I've been working on it for 20 years, not at all full time, but like every year I would take out a month and work on this book. And I just thought these questions are so important, they need 20 years of thought.
All right.
Good thing you were stubborn, so we got to enjoy it.
Yes, and I still am.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you for your time and interest. I very much appreciate it, and how carefully you've read different things I've done. To me, that's very heartwarming.
Thanks, Tyler.
I love going to Sweden, by the way. I've always had great fun there. I've been many times and really look forward to the next time I get there.
Well, you're definitely invited.
All right, you've been very generous with your time. So once again, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you both. Take care. Bye.
Right.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. I hope you learned a thing or two from this conversation with Tyler, and I know for a fact that I did, because I actually listened to it 3 times. If you'd like to get a summary of this episode, go to www.futureskillspodcast.com and sign up to our newsletter. Thank you to Alexander Martin for editing this episode, and we'll see you next week.